Thank you, thank you, thank you. I am again so glad everyone that came out to Real Talk on today. We are having such a great time here, live studio audience. We have some wonderful topics that we have been talking about. And I have another guest that's here today. She's been on Real Talk before. Again, every time she comes, she brings something that needs to be said, that needs to be heard, and most important, you believe it, you're going to feel what God has in store. So I want everyone to put your hands together and help me welcome Dr. Tay Bassett to Real Talk with Jean Price. How are you?
How are you?
Dr. Tay. See, when we get together, it's like being in the living room.
Yes.
We just have a connection. Thank you so much for being on Real Talk with Jean Price today.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I'm really trying to get to what I want to ask, but I think we just finally seen each other again face to face. You know, a couple of times throughout the last couple of months, we've been texting each other, and definitely so many wonderful doors have presented themselves to you. Why don't you share with our viewing audience just a little bit about yourself? And we're going to dive into this conversation. And this conversation is so important because it's important to us. And I think when you begin to see what you've gone through and how other people can come out on the other side, it becomes so important. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what Dr. Tay does?
Well, thank you for having me. It's like you said, it's always a pleasure, and it's just always something different and new when we chat, whether it's via text or on Real Talk every week. But so I'm Dr. Tay Bassett. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and the license part is a testimony in and of itself. I don't mind sharing publicly that I attempted my licensing exam 5 times, and that was because I was dealing with anxiety. Yes, the psychologist was dealing with anxiety herself, and just a lot of lifing, right? Life circumstances. But the testimony is that on the fifth time,
Yes,
say
great.
on the fifth time, I passed. So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and passing my exam afforded me the opportunity to start my own business. So I now have my private practice, Rafa Mind and Body LLC, and I'm seeing clients. So that is truly amazing.
That's good. So let's dive into this conversation. Today we're going to be talking about trauma. And trauma is so huge that it affects so many people in different ways. And when we talk about trauma, I also want to talk about the triggers. Because there are times in life for those of us that have gone through trauma, I remember not recognizing that the triggers were part of the trauma. So let's kind of define trauma for those that need a clinical definition. What is trauma?
So, trauma is not what happens to you, it's how you respond to it. Trauma is a response. And I think that's what gets people confused as to what they're experiencing, because they say, oh, well, what happened to me isn't trauma, it's not traumatic. So I don't have PTSD, I don't have trauma symptoms. But it's not the event itself, it's how you're responding to it. Because one person could have a car accident and be able to drive the next day, the next week, the next year. Another person might be traumatized by it. So it's your response, your emotion. It's a holistic response. It affects your mind, it affects your interactions with people, it affects your body. That's the trauma. So you have the traumatic event, and then you have the trauma response.
So what are some of the misconceptions then? Because people do have misconceptions about trauma. Trauma, from what I've read and studied, is an injury. It's something that happened, right? And sometimes when those injuries, like a sore, they don't always heal. And there are times in the healing process that they still have oozing and they can be infected. So what are some of the misconceptions that people have about trauma?
I love that you made the parallel between mental health and physical health, because I think that helps us to really see the point behind the words, right? So you mentioned healing. If you don't address it, then it can heal, but it might not heal properly. So think about a bone that's broken. If you're walking on a broken foot, but you don't set it properly, and I'm not a medical doctor, so if I'm using the wrong terminology, forgive me, but if it's not set properly, then it will heal. The bone will fuse back together, but it's not going to be whole. Even though it's fused together, it might be misshapen. It's the same thing with trauma. So if you're going throughout life thinking, oh, well, what happened to me wasn't traumatic, then you're not going to address it as though it's a trauma, and then it's not, you're not going to be able to fuse properly. You might be operating thinking, oh, well, I'm a whole person. And, because it wasn't trauma, I should be functioning in this way, not realizing that you've been functioning well, not optimally, but you've been functioning in a trauma response, even though you didn't accept what you went through as a trauma. So I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions, is that it wasn't traumatic to me because it wasn't a trauma.
Part of me getting through trauma, we might have talked about this offline. I had to understand, one day I had to speak somewhere, and really I know it was the Holy Spirit dropped to me, when pain bleeds. And I had never heard that in my life. And I said, oh, let me write that down, because I want to write a book about that. And me being totally transparent in this moment, I felt like my trauma caused me to bleed a lot. And when it was pain bleeds, because when you're in so much pain, Dr. Tay, because of trauma, you begin to bleed on other people.
Yes.
Whether that be telling somebody, listen, this is what I'm going through. And I'm not saying don't tell anybody, you may need help, that's not my point. But I'm saying from the perspective of you're bleeding on others because you're really crying out because the pain can be so deep. How do we as people help people that are bleeding because of pain? And pain took me down a dark path. And I can be transparent and say, I knew I would make it bad. I just didn't know how I was going to make it bad. So I want to kind of talk about that, how that pain, you just keep bleeding and bleeding until you finally get to the place and understand that pain can be healed. I want to talk about that.
As far as how people respond to you, I think grace is so important. Grace, one of my favorite phrases is that grace is social currency. You can exchange grace like you exchange money, but we have to be intentional about it. So the same grace that we're expecting from others, we should be willing to share with other people. So if you're around, even if you don't have the licensing and the certifications and you can't identify what they're going through, recognize that they're going through something and extend them grace. And I think that if we are able to extend people grace, even if we don't know what they're dealing with, we don't know what they've experienced, that helps to create a safe environment for them. And healing can only take place in a safe environment. When you have that cast, going back to the physical parallel, when you have that cast, it's cradling the broken bone, creating a safe environment for healing to take place. So when you extend someone grace, you're actually helping to create a safe environment for their healing. You might not be there for every phase of their healing, but because you were kind to them, because you didn't say, oh, well, why is she acting like that? Maybe you, instead of saying, why are you acting like that? You said, what happened? That's helping them to heal. You played a part. It might be a small part, but you're playing a part in their healing journey.
Listen, we're going to take a commercial break. We'll be back with more information from Dr. Tay. You don't want to miss what the effects of trauma are doing to people's lives. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Real Talk with Jean Price. Listen, we are having a conversation with Dr. Tay, and I tell you, every time we get together, I know we have an audience, but I feel like sometimes it's just Dr. Tay and I. But welcome back, Dr. Tay, to Real Talk. I want to go and I want to talk to you about, I thought about this, how do families deal with trying to support somebody that's dealing with trauma? When I was coming up, and you know my story, I was abused as a child for 12 years, sexually, physical, whatever. But I felt like there was no understanding of me. Even though I was a child up to the age of 15, there was no understanding. How do we get people to understand the effects of trauma? And then how do we support somebody that's going through trauma?
First, you have to be open. Sometimes we're not open to learning, open to being challenged, having the core beliefs that we've held for generations. We're not open to those things being challenged. So if we're not open to learning, open to being challenged, then we're never going to be able to learn about someone else or learn about their experiences. So I think openness is the foundation of being responsive in a positive way to those around us who are experiencing trauma.
But what about if they're afraid? It was very hard, Dr. Tay, for me to open up as a child, teenager, because I was afraid. Number one, I was afraid of my abuser, because he always said he would kill my mother if I ever told. If I ever disclosed, there was a fear there. And fear factor, we understand it now that God hasn't given to us, but when I was in it,
Right.
the fear factor played a major role.
Yeah.
So then how does somebody overcome the fear?
That is a challenge, but it's a challenge that's connected to triumph once you take it on. Because there's so many things, like you mentioned, like the fear was instilled in you by external forces. Right. But in order to overcome the fear, that takes everything internal, because you really have to go against the grain and really kind of psych yourself into believing something that's counter to what's been presented to you in your environment. Right. So it really takes self-reflection, self-awareness, two things that can be stripped of you by a traumatic experience. So it takes, again, openness to taking that deep dive within yourself. And you mentioned, God has not given us the spirit of fear. And I've said this on your show before, the best source of positive affirmations is the word. So you might not feel it yourself, but go to the word. Look for scriptures that speak to your situation, and you might not be believing it because of your trauma response, because of what you've experienced it. But I'm also a professor. Repetition is the key to learning. So you say it until you believe it. I'm not going to say fake it until you make it, but say it until you believe it. Say it until you've internalized it. Thy word have I hidden in my heart, right? So we have to speak those things that be not, so that we can see them manifest, because the power of death and life lie in the tongue, right? So we have to do those, just like I mentioned those scriptures. Even in our darkest places, we have to muster up that mustard seed, right? Muster up the mustard seed faith and a little bit of strength, because God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. We have to do those things, use the little bit we have, so that God can pour on it and expand it. So we might have a little bit of strength, but we're going to the word, and God is going to expand that. We might have a little bit of hope, but if we can reach down and dig deep for that little bit of hope, God is going to expand it. And I think that's probably, for the believer, that's probably the best way that we can go about it, because we don't see everything else, but if we can see that word, God can do a lot with that.
Dr. Tay, you wrote a book.
I think.
I'm telling anybody, you got to get her book. And the book is entitled Reset.
Yes.
Why did you call it Reset?
Your 21-day reset. So it started out as a social media campaign. At the beginning of the year, every day for the first 21 days of January, I would post a saying and a prompt and some homework. And on the 21st day, I was like, hey guys, congratulations, you did the reset, and it's going to be a book. Yay, everybody's excited. That was in 2016. I released my book in December of 2021. I needed my own reset. I needed my own reset so that I could finally birth the book. So it was a reset because it started out as, it's January, we have to take this opportunity to reset, not so much about resolutions, but just like literally resetting, doing a hard reset of your mindset. But the title of the book meant so much more when the reset was for me.
Yeah. I want to, you just pivoted just for a second. I want to talk about that because it does start in the mind when you have to reset.
Yeah.
When did you make up your mind that the reset was necessary? Because I think sometimes we fight it. And oftentimes you hear people say, well, God said, we need to do an audit on our lives. But that's really a reset. We need to take a look internally and kind of see what's going on. When did you finally realize the reset took place?
So with regard to the book, I was in service and serving on the media team behind, this is a story in and of itself, but the media team most often is behind a wall, right? And I was on the computer controlling the screens, And my pastor was preaching, and he said, it was December, so around Christmas time, he said, the best gift you're going to open this season is the gift that's on the inside of you. And in that moment, God reminded me of the 21-day reset that was sitting on Instagram. And he was like, it's time. And I'm like, time for what? Time for what? So the reset, even though it takes a lot of internal work, sometimes it takes a trigger from your environment. You mentioned triggers, right? But in a positive sense.
Yes.
Sometimes it's going to take something in your environment that starts the fire.
Right.
And that's how it started for me. But once he said that, it's like, okay, it's time, but I had to do the internal work.
Right.
I had to overcome the fear.
Oh, that's good. I want to take a question from the viewing audience. One question. Anybody have a question for Dr. Tay? We're talking about trauma and reset. Anybody have a question? Okay.
So you mentioned a safe space, and you talked about trauma. Where does one know if they can heal?
That is a
a great
phenomenal question.
That's a great question.
And I think the best indicator of healing is your response to triggers. So healing doesn't mean that you're not going to notice the trigger.
Right.
Healing means that you're going to respond in a different way.
That's
Your response
Yes,
won't be as strong,
yes.
and it won't be as debilitating, or it won't be debilitating at all.
That's very good.
I think that we can recognize triggers, but we have healed when we can recognize them, manage them in a healthy way, and keep it pushing.
Right. Right.
Because sometimes when we are not healed from our trauma, we experience the trigger and we could be off kilter for days, weeks, months.
Yes.
But when you're healed, you recognize that you're being triggered. You know what your triggers are. Sometimes we don't know what our triggers are.
Yes.
When you're healed, you know what your trigger is. You can manage it,
Yes.
and you can keep going.